Well, moving on from the problem that organisations face, how do you try and change the culture within these large organisations? The idea of the Hillsborough law is that it will impose a criminal sanction on public officers who deliberately lie to protect the organisations which they serve. The aim of those sanctions isn't so much to punish people for lying, although certainly at top levels we'd like to see that happen, but it's also, and perhaps more importantly, to empower people at more junior levels. Those people who feel under pressure to protect their bosses or their colleagues should be able to say, you know what, I'd like to protect you even though you've done wrong, but I'm not about to go to jail for it. And that's really where I think the main thrust of the Act would hit if it's passed, which is empowerment.
The Hillsborough story started, as we all know, with the dreadful tragedy of nearly 100 people losing their lives at a football match. That was dreadful enough, and the gross negligence, as the jury have found, is one of the major parts of the whole Hillsborough story. But the Hillsborough tragedy very quickly, within hours, turned into the Hillsborough outrage, because in the aftermath of the disaster, as we now know, senior police officers distorted the truth, told lies. There was a cover-up of industrial proportions, and despite several legal challenges, both to the High Court and in fact to the Strasbourg Court, despite a judicial scrutiny, despite the original inquests, despite all manner of challenges, the miscarriage of justice that Hillsborough was simply an accident, as found by the original inquests, persisted for certainly 23 years, and in fact really for 27 years until the jury concluded. Now we have to ask, all of us have to ask, how that managed to persist through all of those processes.
Well, what happened was, from the day of the disaster, the police in particular conspired to present a different narrative of events. And the narrative of events from the police point of view that they were promoting was drunken fans, late arriving fans, fans without tickets, as opposed to the real narrative, which was failure to control crowds and a direction to open a gate without measures being taken to stop the influx of crowds into the pens. It started with what we call the Duckenfield lie, a lie that he's admitted telling, but then extended right through the force who were there to protect each other and their superiors.
And it's really telling and really important, I think, to recognise that the writing of the Hillsborough miscarriage of justice started with the campaign of the families, ordinary people, you and me, ordinary people, who took their campaign forward over more than 2 decades before they achieved a breakthrough. Ordinary people. And then finally, after 27 years, the miscarriage of justice was righted by another set of ordinary people, the jury, people just pulled from the community. And I think if it teaches us nothing else, it should teach us all that blindly trusting officialdom or public authorities is something that really none of us should and can do anymore. And therefore we need to look at whether we can improve the playing field, if you like, whether we can see what went wrong and put it right. Now, what went wrong in terms of the Hillsborough outrage was a mixture of straightforward dishonesty by senior officers in some cases, but also an institutional defensiveness by public authorities, or a culture of denial. Largely in the context of Hillsborough, the police, but not exclusively the police. And what we've seen, even in the recent inquests, is that a process which took probably twice as long as it should have done, perhaps more than that, because the public authorities involved chose to act in a defensive way rather than to admit their mistakes, admit their wrongdoings, and to face up and be accountable for what they did. Now, let's just stop there and analyse that. These are public authorities. These are paid for by the public, out of the public purse, out of all of our taxation. And their mission should be to act always in the public interest. And they don't. We argued long and hard during the inquests that there is already a framework of laws around that apply, that require public authorities and public servants to tell the truth, to act with transparency. But plainly, the current framework of laws isn't enough. And therefore, the Hillsborough experience shows us that we need some new statutory law to really have some bite and to make it impossible for public authorities and public servants to act dishonestly or wrongly in terms of the truth and in terms of helping public inquiries or inquests or other court proceedings.
Public bodies will, as part of the legal process, seek to defend themselves. That doesn't mean it's right. And public bodies need to think about acting in the public interest, not about trying to protect their own purses, protect their own personnel, perhaps abide by what their insurance companies are telling them. There are all these criteria which seem to be applied by public bodies, which are just inappropriate when you think that public bodies at the end of the day are funded by the taxpayer, and the taxpayer expects them to tell the truth and to be accountable to the public, not to protect themselves at all costs.
Very often, legislation is not the answer to changing the culture of any organisation. But really here, in terms of Hillsborough law, we need to look at what achieved the great turnaround and the righting of the miscarriage of justice. What achieved that was the campaigning of ordinary people and the decision of ordinary people on a jury. And between those two poles, the officialdom involved, if you like, the public authorities and public servants, they didn't do very well. And there was a plethora of inquiries, challenges, court proceedings, and until more than 2 decades had passed, they all failed. And therefore, we moved to the recent inquests. The process took 2 years, the longest jury process ever in our jurisdiction. And arguably, certainly the families would say that it took that long because of the way that public authorities acted, and that they acted to defend their position rather than get at the truth and achieve justice for the bereaved and for the deceased. So why did that fail? And the answer, or part of the answer to that, must be that the current arrangement, the current laws, the current legal position is simply not robust enough to make public authorities and public servants act in the public interest. And therefore there really is no alternative but to legislation in this particular arena, backed up, of course, by codes of conduct, backed up by will from the government, from Parliament, from civil society, from all of us, if you like, to change the culture of the way that public authorities act and to require them to act always in the public interest.
I think a lot of the families feel that it would be something good that could come out of this awful tragedy. And at the same time, it's not just for the 96, it's looking forward to try and stop these things happening in future.